The crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over our 25th anniversary celebration, silver and white decorations perfectly arranged throughout the Riverside Manor ballroom. When Damien walked through the double doors with his arm possessively wrapped around a stunning brunette, who definitely wasn't his wife of 25 years. But what he didn't know was that I had my own surprise guest waiting in the wings. And when he said, "Honey, I want you to meet someone," I was ready to respond with, "I want you both to meet someone too." The morning of our 25th wedding anniversary dawned crisp and clear. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. October sunlight filtering through the kitchen windows of our colonial home on Elmwood Drive. I stood at the counter, sipping coffee from the china cup Damien had given me for our 20th anniversary, watching the catering staff arrange white roses and silver ribbon in the garden, where our afternoon celebration would begin, before moving to the Riverside Manor for the evening reception. 25 years, a quarter-century of marriage to Damien Carter, the successful real estate developer who had swept me off my feet when I was 28 and working as an event coordinator in downtown Millbrook. I was Maureen Angel then, and I'd kept my maiden name professionally even after becoming Mrs. Carter, though somewhere along the way I'd gradually stopped using it as Damien's prominence in the community grew. "Everything looks perfect, Mrs. Carter," called Maria from the catering team, adjusting the placement of cocktail tables on our back patio. "The flowers for the manor are already being set up. This will be a celebration to remember." If only she knew how memorable it would truly be. I smoothed down my emerald green silk dress, the one I'd spent 3 weeks searching for in boutiques across 3 counties. At 53, I still maintained the figure that had caught Damien's attention all those years ago, though the blonde highlights in my auburn hair now served a more practical purpose than vanity. Tonight was important, not just because it marked 25 years of marriage, but because it would mark the end of living a lie. The past 6 months had been an elaborate performance, ever since I'd discovered the truth about my husband's extracurricular activities. It started innocently enough, a forgotten phone in the car, while Damien showered after his daily run. The notification that popped up was from someone named Celine, accompanied by a photo that definitely wasn't appropriate for a business contact. When I scrolled up through their message history, I found months of intimate exchanges, planning secret meetups, and declarations of love that made my stomach churn. Celine Parks, 34 years old, according to her social media profiles, a marketing executive at Fletcher & Associates, the advertising firm Damien's company frequently used for their high-end property developments. Divorced 2 years ago, or so her posts indicated, with a clean minimalist aesthetic that screamed available to any married man looking for something his wife supposedly couldn't provide. But Celine Parks wasn't as single as she pretended to be. 3 months of careful investigation had revealed that she was very much married to Will Parks, a construction supervisor who traveled frequently for work, which explained how she'd managed to maintain the illusion of availability. Will Parks, who had no idea his wife was conducting an affair with one of Millbrook's most prominent businessmen. Will Parks, who posted loving anniversary tributes to his wife on social media while she was texting my husband about their next rendezvous at the Grandview Hotel. The irony was almost too perfect to resist. I'd spent weeks debating how to handle the situation. The traditional approach would be to confront Damien privately, demand explanations, perhaps suggest marriage counseling. But 25 years had taught me something about my husband. He was a master manipulator who could spin any situation to his advantage. He'd gaslight me into believing I was overreacting, promise to end things with Celine, and probably become more careful about covering his tracks. Nothing would fundamentally change, so I chose a different path. The private investigator I'd hired confirmed what I suspected. Damien had no intention of ending his affair. In fact, their communications suggested he was planning to ask for a separation after our anniversary celebration, timing it to minimize the social awkwardness since he'd already committed to hosting this milestone event. Apparently, 25 years of marriage deserved a farewell party before he moved on to his younger model. But Damien had made one crucial error in his calculation. He'd assumed I was the same accommodating, trusting woman he'd married 2 decades ago. He'd assumed I would go quietly into whatever future he'd planned for me. He'd assumed I wouldn't fight back. He was spectacularly wrong on all counts. My phone buzzed with a text from Jason Ames, my attorney, confirming that all the documents were prepared and ready for tomorrow's filing. Another message from my financial advisor assured me that the asset protection strategies we'd discussed were in place. A third text, from an unknown number, simply read, "I'll be there at 7:30 as discussed. Thank you for this opportunity." That last message was from Will Parks. Contacting him had been the most nerve-wracking part of this entire plan. How do you call a stranger and inform him that his wife is having an affair with your husband? How do you propose a joint confrontation at your own anniversary party? How do you convince someone that public exposure is better than private devastation? It turned out Will Parks was more receptive than I'd expected. His wife's behavior had been suspicious for months. The unexplained absences, the secretive phone calls, the sudden interest in networking events that never seemed to advance her career. When I provided him with photographic evidence and a timeline of their affair, his initial shock quickly transformed into cold determination. "Mrs. Carter," he'd said during our clandestine coffee meeting 2 weeks ago, "I think your husband and my wife have been underestimating both of us. They want to make fools of us. Let's show them what fools really look like." The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Will would arrive at the manor as an unexpected guest, someone I'd invite to surprise Damien with a potential business connection. When Damien inevitably introduced Celine as his colleague, I would reveal Will's true identity and let the dominoes fall where they may. Tonight, 2 marriages would end, but only one of us would be walking away with dignity intact. I checked my watch, 4:30 p.m. Guests would begin arriving at our house in 30 minutes for cocktails, before we all moved to the manor for dinner and dancing. Damien was upstairs getting ready, probably texting Celine about how to navigate the evening without arousing suspicion. Little did he know, suspicion was the least of his problems. The first guests began arriving at 5:15, old friends and colleagues streaming through our front door with congratulatory smiles and anniversary gifts wrapped in silver paper. I played my part perfectly, the gracious hostess, radiant in my emerald dress, accepting kisses on the cheek and compliments about how wonderful Damien and I looked together after all these years. 25 years and you two still look like newlyweds, gushed Patricia Hendricks, our neighbor from down the street. What's your secret? Communication, I replied with a smile that felt like glass. Always being honest with each other about what we really want. Damien worked the crowd with his usual charm, his silver hair perfectly styled, wearing the navy suit I'd bought him for his birthday. He looked every inch the successful businessman celebrating a milestone marriage, only I noticed how frequently he checked his phone, the slight tension around his eyes when he thought no one was looking. At 6:45 we began the migration to Riverside Manor, a convoy of cars winding through Millbrook's historic district to the elegant venue where we'd held Jennifer's wedding reception 3 years ago. The ballroom looked spectacular, cream roses and silver accents, soft lighting that made everyone look 10 years younger, a jazz quartet playing standards from the era when Damien and I first met. I'd arranged the seating carefully. Our table for 8 included my sister Abigail and her husband Reggie, Damien's business partner Marcus, and 2 empty chairs that would soon be occupied by guests who would change everything. "This is incredible, Maureen," Abigail whispered as we surveyed the room. "You've outdone yourself." No wonder Damien looks so proud tonight. Proud. If she only knew what he was actually proud of, successfully maintaining a double life for 8 months while planning to abandon his wife after their anniversary celebration. At 7:25 I excused myself to check on the arrival of our surprise guests. My hands trembled slightly as I walked toward the manor's entrance, but my resolve remained steady. In the parking lot, I spotted a black pickup truck that hadn't been there before. Will Parks sat behind the wheel, his face pale but determined in the streetlight. I tapped on his window, and he rolled it down. "Mrs. Carter." I wasn't sure I could go through with this until I saw her car. He nodded toward a red BMW convertible parked near the entrance. "That's Celine's car. She's here." Yes, they arrived 10 minutes ago. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Damien introduced her to everyone as his valued colleague from Fletcher and Associates. She's wearing a black cocktail dress that costs more than most people's monthly rent. Will's jaw tightened. She told me she was visiting her sister in Portland this weekend. Emergency family situation. I'm sorry, Will. I truly am, but you deserve to know the truth, and they deserve to face the consequences of their choices. He nodded grimly and stepped out of the truck. Will Parks was a solid man in his early 40s, weathered hands suggesting years of honest work, the kind of person who probably never imagined his wife would betray him with someone like Damien. He wore a simple gray suit, clearly his best, and carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who'd been deeply wounded but refused to be broken. "Remember," I said as we walked toward the entrance, "you're here as a potential business contact. Someone I met through my event planning work who might be interested in Damien's new residential development project. Let me handle the introductions, and then we let them destroy themselves." We entered the ballroom together, and I felt the shift in energy immediately. Several guests noticed my return with an unfamiliar man, curiosity sparking in their eyes. At our table, Damien was leaning close to Celine, his hand resting possessively on her lower back as she laughed at something he'd whispered in her ear. She was beautiful, I had to admit. Dark hair styled in an elegant updo, flawless makeup, the kind of confident sensuality that probably made Damien feel virile and desired in ways his middle-aged wife supposedly couldn't. She wore her wedding ring, I noticed, a nice touch that maintained the illusion of respectability while she seduced another woman's husband. "Darling," I called out as Will and I approached the table, "I have someone wonderful for you to meet." Damien looked up, his salesman's smile automatically engaging as he prepared to network with a potential client. Celine turned as well, her expression politely interested until she saw Will. The color drained from her face so quickly I thought she might faint. "Honey," Damien said, standing and extending his hand toward Will, completely oblivious to the drama unfolding. "I'd love you to meet someone very special." He turned toward Celine with a look that made my stomach turn, pride mixed with possession, like a man showing off his prized possession. "This is Celine Parks from Fletcher and Associates. She's been instrumental in the marketing campaign for our Riverside Heights development." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Celine's eyes darted between Will and me, realization dawning that her carefully constructed lies were about to collapse spectacularly. Will stood perfectly still, his gaze fixed on his wife with an expression that could have frozen fire. "Well," I said, my voice carrying clearly across our section of the ballroom, "what a wonderful coincidence. Because I want you both to meet someone too." I placed my hand on Will's shoulder, feeling him tense under my touch. "Damien, Celine, I'd like you to meet Will Parks, Celine's husband." The explosion was immediate and devastating. Celine's champagne glass slipped from nerveless fingers, shattering on the hardwood floor. Damien's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, panic, and finally, raw fury as he realized he'd been outmaneuvered. "What the hell is this?" he hissed, his voice low but audible to everyone at nearby tables. "This," I replied calmly, "is honesty, something you might want to try sometime." The chaos that erupted in those first moments was exactly what I had anticipated, yet somehow more intense than I'd imagined. Conversations at nearby tables stopped mid-sentence as guests turned to witness the drama unfolding at the anniversary couple's table. Celine had gone completely white, her hands shaking as she stared at her husband with the look of someone whose entire world had just imploded. "Will, I can explain," she began. But her husband held up a hand that silenced her immediately. "No," Will said quietly, his voice carrying despite its low volume. "I think Mrs. Carter and I have heard enough explanations to last a lifetime." Damien's face had shifted from shock to a cold calculation I recognized from 25 years of marriage. This was the expression he wore when backed into a corner during business negotiations, assessing his options, looking for an angle, preparing to manipulate his way out of trouble. Maureen, whatever game you think you're playing here, he started. But I cut him off. This isn't a game, Damien. This is accountability. I turned to address the growing circle of observers. I think we need some privacy for this conversation. Could everyone please give us a moment? The other guests at our table, my sister Abigail, her husband Reggie, Damien's business partner Marcus, rose uncertainly and moved toward the bar, though they remained close enough to hear everything. I noticed Marcus looked genuinely shocked, which told me he'd been kept in the dark about Damien's affair. That was interesting information to file away for later. Let me tell you all a story, I said, settling back into my chair as if we were discussing the weather. 25 years ago, I met a charming man at a charity auction in downtown Millbrook. I was 28, working as an event coordinator for Peterson and Associates, and he was this incredibly confident real estate developer who'd just moved to town to start his own company. Celine had found her voice again. Mrs. Carter, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Please don't interrupt the story, dear, I said pleasantly. You'll have your turn to speak soon enough. Will remained standing behind his wife's chair, his presence like a storm cloud. I'd like to hear this story too, he said. I'm sure it will be enlightening. I smiled at him gratefully. Where was I? Oh yes, the charity auction. Damien bid on the weekend getaway package I'd organized, a romantic retreat to the coast. He won, of course, and then asked if I'd like to be his guest, since I'd put together such an appealing package. It was charming, really, romantic. The kind of gesture that sweeps a young woman off her feet. Damien was watching me with growing wariness. He knew me well enough to recognize when I was building toward something, but he couldn't yet see where I was heading. The courtship was wonderful, I continued. Flowers delivered to my office, surprise dinners at the best restaurants, weekend trips to charming bed and breakfasts. Damien had this way of making me feel like the only woman in the world when he focused his attention on me. Do you know that feeling, Celine? The younger woman flinched as if I'd slapped her. We married 18 months later. I gave up my job to support his growing business, answering phones, keeping books, organizing client events. We were a team, you see, building something together, creating a life, a reputation, a place in this community. I paused to sip my wine, letting the silence stretch. The first few years were genuinely happy. We bought the house on Elmwood Drive, joined the country club, hosted dinner parties for potential clients. I threw myself into being the perfect wife for an ambitious man. I learned to play golf even though I hated it, because Damien said it was important for networking. I redecorated our house 3 times in the first 5 years, because he said my taste didn't reflect the level of success we were trying to project. Abigail was listening from the bar area, her expression troubled. She'd witnessed some of these changes over the years, watched her sister gradually reshape herself to fit Damien's vision of what his wife should be. By our 10th anniversary, Damien's company was thriving. We'd established ourselves in Millbrook society. I'd perfected the role of successful businessman's wife, charming at parties, supportive at business functions, understanding when work required his attention more than our marriage did. Maureen, Damien said warningly, this isn't the time or place. Actually, this is exactly the time and place, I replied. Because this is our anniversary celebration, and anniversaries are for reflecting on the journey, aren't they? Will spoke up. I'd like to hear the rest of the story if you don't mind. Of course. Where was I? Oh yes, our 10th anniversary. That's when I noticed the first signs that something had changed. Small things, initially. Damien working later, traveling more frequently, being less interested in the social events we used to attend together. I told myself it was natural. Business growth requires sacrifice. Successful men have demanding schedules. I looked directly at Celine. I'm sure you understand the rationalization process, dear. When you want to believe something, you can explain away quite a lot of evidence to the contrary. By our 15th anniversary, the pattern was well established. Damien would have intense periods of distraction, followed by guilt-induced attention. Expensive jewelry appeared after particularly long absences. Romantic weekend getaways were planned after weeks of emotional distance. I accepted these cycles as the price of being married to a driven, successful man. The ballroom had grown quieter around us, though I was aware of staff discreetly managing the situation, probably on orders from the manor's management. This wasn't the first time they'd hosted a family drama, I imagined. The interesting thing about patterns, I continued, is that once you recognize them, you start to see how predictable they are. The guilt gifts always came after business trips to the same cities. The romantic gestures always followed periods when Damien seemed distant and preoccupied. It was almost like clockwork, really. Damien had gone very still, his businessman's mask finally slipping to reveal genuine fear underneath. 25 years, I concluded. 25 years of being the understanding wife, the supportive partner, the woman who made excuses for her husband's absences and accepted his explanations without question. 25 years of building a life that was apparently nothing more than convenient cover for whatever he really wanted to be doing. I stood up slowly, smoothing down my emerald dress. But the most interesting part of this story is still to come. The turning point came 6 months ago, I continued, my voice steady, despite the tremor I felt inside. March 15th to be exact. A Tuesday morning that started like any other until Damien forgot his phone in the car after his morning run. Celine's breathing had become shallow, and she kept glancing toward the ballroom exits as if calculating her chances of escape. Will remained motionless behind her chair, a silent sentinel waiting for the full truth to emerge. You know how it is with modern phones, I said conversationally. They light up with every notification, text messages, emails, social media alerts. Usually I wouldn't have paid attention, but this particular notification caught my eye because it included a photograph. Damien's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He was still trying to assess how much I actually knew, probably hoping this was some kind of bluff that he could maneuver around. It was a very artistic photograph, I continued. The kind that someone might send to express intimate feelings, accompanied by a message that definitely wasn't related to marketing campaigns or property development. I pulled out my own phone and scrolled to a screenshot I'd carefully preserved. The sender was listed as S. Fletcher, which I thought was interesting, since I knew Damien worked with Fletcher and Associates. But when I scrolled through the message history, I realized this wasn't a business relationship at all. The silence was deafening. Even the jazz quartet seemed to have lowered their volume, though that might have been my imagination. Months of messages, I said, looking directly at Celine. Declarations of love, planning secret meetings, discussing how to navigate family obligations without arousing suspicion. It was quite comprehensive, really, like reading a romance novel, except the male protagonist was my husband, and the female lead was someone else's wife. Will's voice cut through the tension like a blade. Someone else's wife who told me she was working late on client presentations 3 nights a week. Celine finally found her voice again. Will, please, let me explain. Explain what? He asked quietly. How you've been lying to my face for 8 months. How you've been planning romantic getaways with another man, while I was working double shifts to pay for your marketing certification program. The pieces of their deception were falling into place publicly now, each revelation more damaging than the last. I could see guests at other tables straining to hear, some not even pretending to look away from the drama unfolding. But discovering the affair was just the beginning, I continued. Because once you start investigating one lie, you begin to wonder what other lies you've been accepting as truth. I'd spent weeks developing my investigation skills, learning to be methodical and thorough in ways that my trusting nature had never required before. The private investigator I'd eventually hired had been impressed by the groundwork I'd already completed. Phone records were remarkably revealing, I said. Not just the frequency of calls between Damien and Celine, but the timing. Calls made during supposed business meetings, text exchanges during family dinners, communication patterns that showed this wasn't a casual affair, but a full-fledged emotional relationship with plans for the future. Damien finally spoke, his voice tight with controlled anger. Maureen, you're embarrassing yourself, and everyone here. This is our anniversary celebration, for Christ's sake. You're absolutely right, I agreed cheerfully. This is our anniversary celebration, and what better time to share the complete truth about our marriage. I'd discovered that investigating someone's deception was like pulling a loose thread. Once you started, the entire fabric began to unravel. Bank records showed charges at restaurants I'd never been to, hotels in cities where Damien supposedly had solo business meetings, jewelry purchases that had never appeared in our home. The most interesting discovery was the credit card I didn't know about, I continued. Opened in Damien's name, but sent to a post office box I'd never heard of. The statements made for fascinating reading: romantic dinners, weekend getaways, expensive gifts that certainly weren't coming home to me. Celine had begun crying silently, tears smearing her carefully applied makeup. Mrs. Carter, please. Please what, dear? Please continue pretending I don't know what you and my husband have been doing for the past 8 months. Please go back to being the naive wife, who accepts whatever story she's told. Will moved around to face his wife directly. How long? He asked simply. How long have you been sleeping with him? The question hung in the air like a physical presence. Around us, the anniversary celebration continued in a surreal bubble. Servers refilling water glasses, the quartet playing soft jazz, other guests determinedly pretending not to witness a marriage exploding in real time. 8 months, Celine whispered. Since February, Will stated flatly. Since my father's funeral. When you said you needed space to grieve, and couldn't handle physical intimacy. When I spent 3 months sleeping in the guest room, because you said my presence reminded you too much of loss and family trauma. The cruelty of it was staggering. Using a family tragedy as cover for an affair, manipulating her husband's compassion to create space for betrayal. It wasn't like that, Celine protested weakly. Then what was it like? I asked. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like two people who decided their marriage vows were inconvenient obstacles to getting what they wanted. I'd spent months preparing for this moment, gathering evidence, planning my approach, consulting with attorneys and investigators. But nothing had prepared me for the satisfying clarity of finally speaking the truth aloud, of watching the careful facades crumble under the weight of reality. The most remarkable thing, I continued, was discovering that this wasn't just about sex or romance. This was about planning a future together. Discussions of divorce timelines, property division, how to minimize social embarrassment while transitioning to new relationships. Damien's mask finally slipped completely. Enough, he said harshly. This stops now. Actually, I replied calmly, this is just getting started. The moment had arrived, the confrontation I'd been orchestrating for months. Damien stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor with a sound that cut through the ambient music like a gunshot. His face had transformed from the polished businessman's mask into something raw and desperate. We're leaving, he announced, reaching for Celine's arm. This is insane, Maureen. You're making a spectacle of yourself. But Will stepped forward, blocking their path with quiet authority. No one's leaving until we finish this conversation. You don't get to tell me what to do, Damien snapped, his usual charm evaporating entirely. This is between my wife and me. Your wife? Will's voice carried a dangerous edge. The same wife you've been betraying for 8 months with my wife? I think that makes this between all 4 of us. The confrontation was drawing attention from across the ballroom now. Our anniversary celebration had become the evening's entertainment, though I found I didn't care about the social embarrassment that would have mortified me just hours earlier. Damien, I said calmly, remaining seated while chaos erupted around me. Sit down. We're going to have the honest conversation we should have had years ago. I don't have to listen to this, he replied, but his voice lacked conviction. He was trapped between Will's physical presence and the growing circle of observers who would witness his cowardice if he fled. Celine tried a different approach. Mrs. Carter, I understand you're hurt, but this isn't the way to handle. Handle what? I interrupted smoothly. Handle discovering that my husband and his mistress have been planning my divorce for me. Handle learning that you've both been lying to everyone who cares about you. Handle the fact that you're wearing your wedding ring while seducing another woman's husband. The wedding ring comment hit its mark. Celine's hand instinctively moved to cover the gold band, as if she could hide the symbol of her own betrayal. That's enough, Damien said, his voice rising despite his obvious desire to keep this private. You want to destroy our marriage? Fine, but you don't get to humiliate me in front of half of Millbrook. I'm not destroying our marriage, Damien. You already did that. I'm just making sure everyone understands what actually happened. Will spoke up, his gaze never leaving his wife's face. Celine, do you love him? The question was so direct, so simply stated, that it seemed to cut through all the pretense and manipulation. Celine looked between the three of us, her husband, her lover, and the wife she'd helped betray, and for a moment I saw genuine anguish in her expression. Yes, she whispered. And you, Damien? I asked pleasantly. Do you love her? My husband's eyes darted around the room, calculating the social and financial cost of honesty. This was the moment that would define the rest of his life in Millbrook. Would he own his choices, or try to manipulate his way out of consequences? Yes, he said finally, the word emerging like it had been forced from him. Well then, I said, rising gracefully from my chair, that makes this much simpler. I reached into my small evening purse and withdrew a manila envelope, placing it on the table between us. Since you've both been planning our respective divorces anyway, I thought I'd save you the trouble of having awkward conversations later. Damien stared at the envelope as if it might explode. What is that? Divorce papers, I replied cheerfully. Filed this morning, actually. I thought our anniversary celebration would be the perfect time to serve them, don't you? Very symbolic. The gasps from nearby tables were audible now. Our drama had become the floor show, but I discovered that public exposure felt liberating rather than humiliating. Will reached into his jacket pocket and produced his own envelope. Celine, I believe this belongs to you too. The symmetry was perfect, two betrayed spouses taking control of their situations simultaneously, refusing to be victims of their partner's deception any longer. You can't be serious, Celine breathed, staring at the legal documents as if they were venomous snakes. Deadly serious, Will replied. Did you really think I'd keep living a lie after tonight? Damien's businessman's instincts finally kicked in. This is all very dramatic, but divorce is complicated. There are assets to consider, reputation management, proper procedures, all handled, I interrupted. Amazing what you can accomplish when you're not spending your time covering up affairs and planning romantic getaways with other people's spouses. The jazz quartet had stopped playing entirely now, the bandleader apparently recognizing that their soft background music was inadequate for the drama unfolding. The silence felt pregnant with possibility, the end of one story, and the beginning of something entirely different. 25 years, I said, looking directly at Damien. 25 years of marriage, and this is how you wanted it to end. With public humiliation and legal documents at our anniversary party. I never wanted it to end like this, he protested. Then you should have thought about consequences before you started sleeping with someone else's wife. The aftermath of serving divorce papers in front of half of Millbrook's social elite was swift and merciless. Within minutes, Damien had shifted into damage control mode, his survival instincts overriding whatever shock he'd initially felt. This was the side of my husband I'd rarely seen, the calculating businessman, who treated every crisis as a negotiation to be won. This is a private matter, he announced, loudly enough for the nearby tables to hear, attempting to regain control of the narrative. Maureen is understandably emotional, but these issues should be handled through proper channels, not public theatrics. Proper channels? I laughed, the sound carrying across the ballroom. Like the proper way you handled our marriage, through secret credit cards and clandestine hotel meetings. Celine had gone completely silent, clutching Will's divorce papers like they might disappear if she held them tightly enough. The confident, sophisticated woman who'd walked into my anniversary celebration had been replaced by someone who looked shell-shocked and desperate. Mrs. Carter, she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Surely we can discuss this privately. There are ways to handle these situations with discretion. Discretion. Will's voice cut through her plea like ice. You mean the same discretion you showed when you were texting your lover during our anniversary dinner last month? When you used my grief over my father's death as an excuse to avoid intimacy while you were sleeping with another man. The cruelty of Celine's deception was becoming clear to everyone within earshot. Using a spouse's tragedy as cover for infidelity struck at something fundamental about human decency, and I could see the judgment forming in the faces around us. My sister Abigail had moved closer, her expression torn between family loyalty and obvious shock. Maureen, she said quietly. Maybe we should take this somewhere private. Why? I asked, genuinely. So Damien can spin this into something I did wrong. So he can control the story and make me the villain who destroyed our marriage with unreasonable expectations. Damien's business partner Marcus appeared at his shoulder, clearly uncomfortable but trying to maintain professional solidarity. Damien, perhaps we should step outside. No, Damien said sharply. I'm not running away from my own anniversary party because my wife has chosen to have a public breakdown. The characterization of my calculated exposure as a breakdown was typical Damien, reframing reality to cast himself as the reasonable party dealing with an irrational woman. It was a manipulation tactic I'd witnessed him use in business disputes, and seeing it deployed against me crystallized something important about our relationship dynamics. This isn't a breakdown, Damien, I said calmly. This is accountability, something you've managed to avoid for most of our marriage. Will stepped closer to the table, his presence adding weight to my position. Mr. Carter, my wife has been lying to me for 8 months while she conducted an affair with you. I don't think Mrs. Carter is the one having a breakdown here. The alliance between Will and me was clearly unsettling both Damien and Selene. They'd expected to control their respective narratives separately, managing their spouses individually. They hadn't planned for their victims to compare notes and coordinate responses. Look, Damien said, attempting his most persuasive tone. Everyone's emotions are running high. Why don't we all go home, cool down and handle this through lawyers tomorrow, like civilized people? Because civilized people don't conduct 8-month affairs while planning their spouse's social humiliation, I replied. Civilized people don't use family tragedies as cover for betrayal. Civilized people don't introduce their mistresses at anniversary celebrations. The growing audience was beginning to take sides, their body language revealing whose version of events they found more credible. I could see heads nodding in agreement when I spoke, disapproving glances directed at Damien and Selene when their deceptions were exposed. This is ridiculous, Selene said suddenly, her composure finally cracking entirely. Will, you can't seriously be supporting this ambush. We're all adults here. Marriages end. People fall in love. It doesn't have to be this dramatic. Will's response was quiet but devastating. You're right. Marriages do end. But honest people have difficult conversations before they start sleeping with other people. They don't conduct elaborate deceptions while their spouses trust them completely. The moral clarity was undeniable. Whatever personal failings might exist in any marriage, the systematic betrayal and manipulation Damien and Selene had engaged in crossed lines that most people recognized instinctively. I'm calling my attorney, Damien announced, pulling out his phone with theatrical authority. This hostile environment isn't conducive to rational discussion. Good idea, I agreed cheerfully. Mine is already on retainer. Has been for 3 months actually. Amazing how much preparation you can accomplish when you're not distracted by conducting affairs. The revelation that I'd been planning this confrontation for months rather than acting impulsively clearly unnerved both of them. They were beginning to realize that the woman they'd been underestimating had orchestrated this entire evening with careful precision. 3 months? Damien's voice carried a note of genuine surprise mixed with grudging respect. Actually closer to 4, I corrected. Turns out investigating your husband's secret life is quite time-consuming, but very educational. The revelation that I'd been planning this confrontation for months had visibly shaken both Damien and Selene, but I wasn't finished. The investigation I'd conducted had uncovered layers of deception that went far beyond a simple affair. And if we were having this conversation publicly, it might as well be complete. 4 months of investigation tends to turn up interesting information, I continued, my voice carrying clearly across the now silent section of the ballroom. For instance, did everyone know that Damien and Selene have been apartment hunting together? Selene's face went ashen. This was clearly information she'd hoped would remain private until they were ready to make their relationship public on their own terms. That's not, she started, but I cut her off with a raised hand. Riverside Towers, Unit 4B, a lovely 2-bedroom with a view of the harbor. The lease application was submitted 3 weeks ago, listing both of your names as co-tenants. Your combined income projections were quite optimistic, considering you were both still married to other people. Will's expression darkened further. A lease application? You were planning to move in together? It gets better, I said, reaching into my purse for a second envelope. They've also opened a joint savings account. Valley Trust Bank, opened 6 weeks ago with an initial deposit of $12,000. The account paperwork lists it as future planning funds. The systematic nature of their deception was becoming clear to everyone listening. This wasn't a passionate affair that had spiraled out of control. It was a calculated plan to build a life together while maintaining their marriages as convenient cover stories. Joint financial planning while lying to your respective spouses, Will said slowly, his voice heavy with disgust. How long were you planning to keep up this charade? Damien finally found his voice again, though it lacked his usual commanding presence. Maureen, you're taking things out of context. People need to plan for different scenarios. Different scenarios. I laughed harshly. Is that what you call systematically preparing to abandon your wife? Because I have the context right here. I pulled out printed emails that my investigator had recovered from Damien's deleted files. Email exchanges discussing the optimal timing for ending your respective marriages. Cost-benefit analyses of divorce settlements versus maintaining the status quo. Financial projections for combining your assets after you were both single. The cold, business-like approach to destroying two families was perhaps more damaging than the emotional betrayal. These weren't people swept away by uncontrollable passion. They were calculating individuals who had weighed the costs of their actions and decided the benefits outweighed the damage to their spouses. There's more, I continued relentlessly. Celine, you might be interested to know that Damien has been less than honest with you about his financial situation. Both Damien and Celine looked startled by this shift in focus. They'd expected accusations about their affair, but questioning the foundation of their relationship with each other was apparently unexpected. What are you talking about? Celine demanded, speaking directly to me for the first time with something approaching defiance. The property development deal that's been taking up so much of his time lately. The one he told you would make him wealthy enough to provide the lifestyle you deserve. It's completely leveraged against our marital assets. If it fails, and my sources suggest it's in serious trouble, Damien could lose everything, including the house you thought you'd be sharing. Damien's face had gone red with fury. You have no right to discuss my business dealings. Our business dealings, I corrected. Community property laws are quite clear about assets acquired during marriage. That failed development project isn't just your problem, it's a marital debt that affects any settlement. Will was watching this exchange with fascination. So you've been lying to both of them, he said to Damien. Lying to your wife about the affair, and lying to your mistress about your financial stability. It's not lying, Damien protested weakly. It's managing information disclosure. The euphemism was so ridiculous that several nearby guests actually snorted with laughter. The man who'd built his reputation on integrity and straightforward dealing was revealing himself to be someone who viewed deception as a management technique. Managing information disclosure, I repeated thoughtfully. Is that what you call it when you forge my signature on loan documents? The silence that followed was absolute. Even the ambient noise from other parts of the ballroom seemed to fade as everyone within earshot processed this escalation. You forged her signature? Will asked, his voice dangerously quiet. That's not. Damien was finally speechless, caught in a deception too large to explain away. Loan documents for the apartment lease deposit, I clarified, and the joint savings account, and several business expenses that required spousal authorization under our prenuptial agreement. Apparently, when you're planning to leave your wife, her actual consent becomes inconvenient. The criminal implications were hanging in the air now, transforming what had been a marital drama into something potentially much more serious. Forgery, financial fraud, identity theft, these weren't just relationship problems but legal violations that could have lasting consequences. This conversation is over, Damien announced desperately. I'm leaving, and I'm taking Celine with me. Actually, I said pleasantly. I don't think you are. You don't think I'm leaving. Damien's voice carried a dangerous edge, his businessman's composure finally cracking under the weight of public exposure. Watch me. He grabbed Celine's arm, attempting to pull her from her chair, but she resisted, staring at me with a mixture of fear and calculation. The revelation about forged signatures had clearly shifted something in her perception of the man she'd been planning a future with. Damien, she said slowly, You forged your wife's signature on legal documents. It's complicated, he replied tersely, still trying to maneuver her toward the exit. Business requires flexibility in approach. That's fraud, Will interrupted flatly. Financial fraud using identity theft. That's not complicated. That's criminal. The word criminal seemed to echo through our section of the ballroom. Several guests who had been pretending not to listen were now openly staring, their anniversary celebration dinner forgotten in favor of the real-time destruction of one of Millbrook's most prominent couples. Celine, I said gently, my voice cutting through Damien's increasingly desperate attempts to control the situation. You might want to consider whether this is really the man you want to build a future with. Someone who commits fraud against his wife probably won't hesitate to deceive his girlfriend when it becomes convenient. The psychological manipulation was deliberate and effective. Celine's face reflected the dawning realization that if Damien could systematically lie to and steal from a woman he'd been married to for 25 years, her own security in their relationship was probably an illusion. The apartment lease, she said quietly, looking at Damien with new wariness. You said you had handled all the financial requirements. Did you forge signatures for that too? Damien's silence was answer enough. Jesus Christ, Will muttered, running a hand through his hair. Celine, what the hell have you gotten yourself into? For the first time since this confrontation began, I felt a flicker of sympathy for the other woman. Whatever her moral failings in conducting an affair, she was clearly realizing that she'd been as much a victim of Damien's manipulations as I had been. Mrs. Carter, Celine said, her voice barely above a whisper, when you said you'd been investigating for 4 months, what else did you find? It was a question that revealed her growing understanding that she didn't know the man she'd been planning to leave her husband for. The confident, successful businessman who had swept her into an affair was revealing himself to be someone capable of systematic deception and criminal behavior. Would you like the complete list? I asked, genuinely curious whether she was prepared for the full scope of Damien's duplicity. She nodded slowly, ignoring Damien's increasingly frantic attempts to end the conversation and remove her from the scene. 2 other affairs in the past 5 years, I began methodically. Financial irregularities in his business dealings that suggest tax evasion. A gambling problem he's been hiding from everyone, including you, and a pending lawsuit from a former business partner who claims Damien embezzled construction funds. Each revelation hit like a physical blow. Celine's carefully constructed image of her sophisticated, successful lover was disintegrating in real time, replaced by the portrait of a man whose entire life was built on deception and criminal activity. You're lying, Damien said desperately, but his voice lacked conviction. She's making this up to destroy our relationship. I have documentation for everything, I replied calmly. 4 months of professional investigation tends to be quite thorough. Would you like me to continue? Will stepped closer to his wife, his anger apparently giving way to something approaching protectiveness. Whatever Celine had done to their marriage, watching her realize the extent to which she'd been manipulated and used, seemed to trigger his basic human decency. Celine, he said quietly, we need to talk, privately, about what you've gotten yourself into and how to protect yourself legally. The offer was unexpected and generous, a betrayed husband offering to help the wife who had destroyed their marriage because he recognized she was in danger from the man she'd trusted. Don't listen to them, Damien said, his voice taking on a pleading quality. They're trying to manipulate you, turn you against me. Everything we've planned together, everything you've planned was built on lies, I interrupted. Lies to me, lies to her, lies to your business partners, lies to the IRS. When someone's entire life is a lie, Celine, what makes you think your relationship with him would be any different? The logical progression was undeniable. Celine looked between Damien and the rest of us, her expression reflecting the horrible realization that she'd destroyed her marriage for a man who had been deceiving her as thoroughly as he'd been deceiving everyone else. I need to go, she said suddenly, standing on unsteady legs. I need to think. Celine, don't. Damien started, but Will moved to block his approach to his wife. She said she needs to think, Will said firmly. That seems like an excellent idea for everyone involved. The evening that had begun as an anniversary celebration was ending with the complete dissolution of two marriages and the exposure of criminal activity that would likely have consequences far beyond divorce proceedings. But for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe freely. The Riverside Manor ballroom had transformed from an elegant anniversary celebration into something resembling a crime scene. Not literally, of course, but the careful social fabric that had held our community gathering together had unraveled so completely that guests were unsure whether to stay or flee. I remained seated at our table, surrounded by the debris of my 25-year marriage, wilted roses, abandoned champagne glasses, and legal documents that would reshape multiple lives. The strange calm I felt was almost supernatural, as if I were observing this drama from outside my own body. Celine had fled toward the ladies' room, her elegant black dress, a stark contrast to her obvious emotional collapse. Will followed at a respectful distance, probably recognizing that his wife needed space to process the magnitude of her situation. Whatever conversation they would have would determine whether their marriage could survive her betrayal and his remarkable offer of protection. Damien stood alone near our table, his usual commanding presence reduced to something desperate and calculating. The businessman who had controlled every aspect of our shared life for 2 decades was finally facing consequences he couldn't manipulate or negotiate away. "This isn't over, Maureen," he said quietly, his voice carrying just enough menace to remind me why I'd been right to plan this confrontation in public rather than private. "Actually, it is over," I replied calmly. "It's been over for months. Tonight just made it official." My sister Abigail approached cautiously, her husband Reggie hovering uncertainly behind her. "Maureen, what do you need? How can we help?" The question was so simple, so fundamentally decent, that it almost brought tears to my eyes. After months of investigating betrayal and planning confrontations, having someone simply offer help without agenda or judgment felt revolutionary. "I need to go home," I said, gathering my purse and the manila envelope that had started this entire cascade of revelations. "I need to begin the next phase of my life." "I'll drive you," Abigail offered immediately. "Thank you, but I drove myself. I plan to leave independently tonight, regardless of how this conversation went." The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone within earshot. The woman who had arrived as half of a celebrated couple was leaving as a complete individual, capable of making her own decisions and handling her own transportation. Damien made one final attempt at control. "We'll need to discuss practical matters, property division, financial arrangements, how to handle the social aspects." "We'll discuss everything through our attorneys," I interrupted. "As of tonight, all communication between us goes through legal representatives." The finality of it seemed to hit him like a physical blow. 25 years of marriage, and we were ending with the formal distance of adversaries in litigation. "You're really going to destroy everything we built together?" he asked, a note of genuine bewilderment in his voice. "I'm not destroying anything, Damien. I'm simply stopping my participation in the lie we've been living." I stood slowly, smoothing down my emerald dress one final time. Around us, the anniversary celebration was dissolving as guests made their excuses and departed, unwilling to witness any more of our family's public implosion. 25 years, I said, looking directly at my husband for what I suspected would be the last time in this context. 25 years of marriage, and this is how it ends. Not with love or regret or even anger, but with the simple recognition that some things cannot and should not be saved. With that, I walked out of the Riverside Manor and into whatever came next. The drive home through Millbrook's quiet streets felt surreal, as if I were traveling through a familiar landscape that had somehow been fundamentally altered. The colonial houses with their warm porch lights, the tree-lined avenues where I'd jogged for years, the corner market where Damien and I had bought groceries together, everything looked the same, yet nothing felt familiar anymore. My phone began ringing before I'd even reached Elmwood Drive. First my daughter Sarah, calling from Boston where she worked as a pediatric nurse. Then my son Michael from Denver, where he managed a small tech startup. Word traveled fast in the digital age, and apparently someone at the anniversary celebration had already shared the evening's dramatic developments on social media. I let the calls go to voicemail, needing silence to process what had just occurred. The conversations with my children would come, but they required more emotional energy than I possessed in this moment of strange crystalline clarity. At home, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat in the living room that had hosted countless dinner parties and family gatherings. The photos on the mantel told the story of our family's evolution: wedding pictures, baby photos, graduations, holidays, all those moments when we'd appeared to be the perfect family unit, while cracks I'd refused to acknowledge slowly widened beneath the surface. The first returned call I made was to Sarah. At 22, she'd always been more perceptive than her younger brother about the tensions in our household. "Mom, what happened?" she asked, without preamble when she answered. "Amanda Peterson posted something on Instagram about Dad and another woman at your anniversary party." I explained the evening's events as gently as possible, watching through the window as neighbors' houses grew dark around me. Sarah listened without interruption, occasionally making small sounds of dismay or understanding. "I'm not surprised," she said, finally. "I mean, I'm shocked that it happened so publicly, but the affair itself, Dad's been different for years. Distant, like he was waiting for something to change." Her maturity in processing this information reminded me that adult children often see family dynamics more clearly than the parents living within them. Sarah had apparently been watching our marriage deteriorate from her own perspective, drawing conclusions I'd been too close to recognize. "Are you okay, Mom? Really okay?" The question required honest self-examination. Was I okay? I felt exhausted, vindicated, frightened, and strangely liberated all at once. But underneath those conflicting emotions was something that surprised me: relief. "I think I will be," I told her. "For the first time in years, I feel like I can breathe freely." Michael's call 20 minutes later was more volatile. As the younger child and only son, he'd idolized his father despite their occasionally difficult relationship. The revelation that Damien had been systematically betraying our family struck him as a fundamental betrayal of everything he'd believed about masculine honor and integrity. "What kind of man brings his mistress to his own anniversary party?" he demanded angrily. "What kind of person does that to someone who's supported them for 25 years? I found myself in the unexpected position of counseling my adult children through their own processing of their father's character flaws, helping them understand that people could be simultaneously loving parents and deeply flawed spouses. The complexity of family relationships didn't end simply because a marriage did. The weeks following the anniversary party confrontation passed in a blur of legal consultations, paperwork, and the strange process of dismantling a life I'd spent 25 years building. The Millbrook community's reaction had been swift and decisive. Public sympathy fell overwhelmingly on my side, while Damien found himself increasingly isolated as details of his deceptions continued to emerge. I'd moved into a temporary apartment across town while our house remained tied up in divorce proceedings. The furnished one-bedroom space was a stark contrast to the sprawling colonial, where I'd entertained and hosted for decades, but it offered something invaluable: complete autonomy over every decision, from what temperature to set the thermostat to what music played while I cooked dinner. For the first time since I was 28 years old, I was learning who Maureen Angel truly was when she wasn't defining herself in relation to someone else's needs and preferences. The discovery process was both liberating and occasionally overwhelming. Simple choices like grocery shopping became exercises in self-exploration. Did I actually like the expensive organic vegetables Damien had insisted upon, or would I be perfectly happy with regular produce? Did I enjoy the classical music he'd preferred for dinner parties, or would I rather listen to the folk songs I'd loved in college? My attorney Jennifer Walsh proved to be not just legally competent, but unexpectedly supportive of my personal transformation. During one of our meetings to review financial documents, she observed that many of her divorced clients struggled with the transition from couple identity to individual autonomy. "You seem to be embracing the change rather than fighting it," she noted. "That's actually quite rare, especially after long marriages." "Maybe because the marriage had been over for years," I replied. "I just finally stopped pretending otherwise." The financial investigation had revealed the full scope of Damien's deceptions. Beyond the affair and forged signatures, there were business irregularities that had attracted the attention of state investigators. His construction company was under scrutiny for bid manipulation on municipal contracts, and the pending lawsuit I'd mentioned at the anniversary party had expanded into a broader investigation of his business practices. Watching his professional reputation crumble was almost harder than discovering his personal betrayals. The man I'd married had possessed genuine integrity once, or at least I'd believed he had. Understanding how thoroughly that person had been corrupted by greed and selfishness forced me to question my own judgment about character and motivation. But it also freed me from any lingering guilt about ending our marriage. Whatever Damien had become, he was no longer someone I could respect or trust, let alone love. The most unexpected development came through Will Parks, who had become an unlikely friend during our parallel divorce proceedings. His marriage to Celine had ended swiftly once the full scope of her deception became clear, but unlike Damien, she had at least shown genuine remorse for the damage she'd caused. "She's moving back to her parents in Vermont," Will told me during one of our coffee meetings. "Says she needs to figure out who she is when she's not trying to be what someone else wants." I understood that impulse completely. The process of rediscovering authentic identity after years of accommodation was challenging but essential work. "What about you?" I asked. "What's next for Will Parks?" He smiled, the first genuinely happy expression I'd seen from him since that night at the manor. "I'm thinking about starting my own contracting business. Maybe it's time to stop working for other people's dreams and start building my own." 6 months after the anniversary party that ended my marriage, I stood in the kitchen of my new home, a charming Victorian cottage I'd purchased with my divorce settlement, complete with a garden where I could grow whatever flowers suited my taste rather than what impressed the neighbors. The morning sun streamed through windows I'd chosen to leave uncurtained, illuminating walls painted in the warm yellow I'd always loved but never been allowed to use. The transformation hadn't been easy. There were nights when the loneliness felt overwhelming, moments when I questioned whether destroying my marriage so publicly had been necessary, days when starting over at 53 seemed impossibly daunting. But those moments of doubt became increasingly rare as I settled into a life that was genuinely my own. The doorbell rang as I was arranging fresh peonies from my garden, another small rebellion, since Damien had always considered them too common for our formal arrangements. Through the window, I saw Will Parks standing on my front porch, holding what appeared to be a small wrapped gift. "Maureen," he said when I opened the door, "I hope I'm not intruding. I brought you something to celebrate your new business venture." 2 months earlier, I'd launched Angel Events, returning to the event coordination work I'd abandoned when I married Damien. The business was small but growing steadily, built on relationships I'd maintained through years of volunteer work and community involvement. There was profound satisfaction in using skills I'd developed during my marriage to create financial independence from it. "Will, that's so thoughtful," I said, accepting the package and inviting him in. "How did you know today was special?" "Because today marks exactly 6 months since we both decided to stop accepting lives we didn't choose," he replied with a smile. I thought that deserved recognition. Inside the wrapping was a small framed photo, a picture of us from that night at the Riverside Manor, captured by someone's phone camera during our confrontation with our respective spouses. We looked determined and strong, two people who had refused to be victims of other people's deceptions. "I love this," I said, genuinely touched by the gesture. "It reminds me that courage is contagious. If you hadn't stood up with me that night, I might have lost my nerve. And if you hadn't shown me it was possible to fight back with dignity, I might have accepted Celine's lies indefinitely," he replied. We made a good team. We sat in my sunny living room, drinking coffee and sharing updates on our new lives. Will's contracting business was thriving, built on the reputation for honesty and craftsmanship he'd developed over years of working for other people. My children had both visited recently, expressing pride in my independence and strength they'd never seen during my marriage. "Do you ever regret it?" Will asked. "The public confrontation, the way everything ended." I considered the question carefully, looking around at the home I'd chosen and decorated according to my own preferences, thinking about the business I was building and the relationships I was nurturing. "I regret that it was necessary," I said finally. "But I don't regret doing it." For the first time in 25 years, I'm living authentically. That's worth whatever pain the transition required. As Will prepared to leave, he paused at the door. What's next for Maureen Angel? I smiled, feeling the truth of my answer in every cell of my body. Whatever I choose, and that makes all the difference. The future stretched ahead, uncertain but entirely my own to create. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.